Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video, I want to talk about synaptic communication. The first thing to ask, I guess, is what is a synapse? There are two types of, or at least two major types of synaptic connections, or a synapse. I'll draw the first one over here, and this is the simplest probably. Imagine two cells right up against each other, and each of those cells makes these proteins in their membrane that are called gap junctions. As you can see, I've drawn that such that on one cell, the gap junction makes a channel. When that connects to a gap junction on the next cell, that continues the channel. So now there's an open channel between the two cells through which ions can travel. I'm assuming you already know what an action potential is, but remember that we're talking about with resting potential, the cell is negative on the inside, positive on the outside. And during an action potential, that charge is going to flip. Remember that the major ion involved here is sodium. Sodium diffuses into that cell, bringing positive charge, and that then causes the charge to flip. Those same sodium ions, now that have diffused into this cell, causing it to undergo an action potential, those sodium ions can now diffuse through these gap junctions and cause the same kind. It was at resting potential, but now the inside is going to become positive because of the sodium entering. It's going to initiate an action potential in this next cell. So this type of synapse is one cell communicating usually an action potential to the next cell simply by ions traveling through these gap junctions. We call this specific type of synapse an electrical synapse. An electrical synapse. So nothing real complicated here, just these proteins in the membrane, again called gap junctions, that allow a channel to be created between the two cells, letting charged ions go through. This cell can now communicate electrically with the next cell, an action potential. One place where this is really important is in our hearts. Between the heart muscle cells, there are these gap junctions, these electrical synaptic connections, so that when one heart muscle cell contracts, any heart muscle cells that are connected to it will then contract as well at almost the same time. And the importance of that in the heart is a pump. And for it to be a pump, we want it to squeeze, we want all the heart cells to squeeze all at one time to make an efficient pump. This is one of the ways those synaptic, electrical synaptic connections between the cardiac myocytes, the heart cells, that electrical synapse is part of what allows for the heart's muscle to contract all at once. So again, that's an electrical synapse. Now let's talk about a chemical synapse. Chemical synapse is the type that's usually between two neurons or between a neuron and the next cell that it is signaling to. The neuron that's going to signal to the next cell is called the presynaptic neuron or the presynaptic cell. And recall that neurons have an axon. That axon has a terminal end, which is known as the axon terminal or the axonal buton. And this axon terminal, axonal buton, contains vesicles that have neurotransmitter inside of them. The other thing that is present on the membrane of the axon or axonal buton are channels for calcium. Specifically, they're voltage-gated calciums. They're voltage-gated channels for calcium, or voltage-gated calcium channels. So that's what's going on in the cell that's going to initiate the communication. What I'm drawing now is the membrane of the cell that this neuron is going to communicate to, and I'm going to leave that space a little bit larger just so I can draw some stuff. These two membranes are really close together, but they're not connected, so the communication doesn't happen via a connection. There are proteins here that keep them located together, but they're not directly connected. There's a space here, and that space is called the synaptic cleft or the synaptic gap. Next, on this cell that's being communicated to, which is called the postsynaptic cell, and this membrane, therefore, by the way, is called the postsynaptic membrane. And this could be another neuron, again, or it could be a muscle cell or a cell inside of a gland. At any rate, this postsynaptic membrane will have receptors for the neurotransmitter that's in this axon terminal. Okay, with those bits of anatomy, and I'll fly through them really quickly again, with these bits of anatomy, we're ready to tell the story. We've got the axon from the neuron that's going to communicate to this next cell. We've got the axon terminal. We've got vesicles filled with neurotransmitter. We've got a voltage-gated calcium channel in the membrane of the axon terminal. And then we've got the postsynaptic cell and its postsynaptic membrane with neurotransmitter receptors on that membrane. So here's how chemical synaptic communication occurs. An action potential comes down this axon and reaches the axon terminal. That change of charge, that flipping of charge, stimulates these calcium channels in the axon terminal, stimulates these calcium channels to open, and now calcium enters the axon terminal. The presence of that increase in calcium causes these vesicles containing neurotransmitter to perform exocytosis at the presynaptic membrane and to dump their neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter then diffuses across the synaptic cleft or synaptic gap, and the neurotransmitter binds to the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, or receptors on the postsynaptic cell. And there we have to stop, because what happens next depends. It depends upon what this particular neurotransmitter is that's being released, and it depends upon what particular receptor we have here to that neurotransmitter. I'll go through it one more time quickly, but here's the story again of chemical synaptic communication, or communication at the chemical synapse. An action potential comes down the axon. It reaches the axon terminal. The voltage change of that action potential causes voltage-gated calcium channels to open, and calcium enters the axon terminal. The presence of that calcium causes these vesicles filled with neurotransmitter to bind with and perform exocytosis on the presynaptic membrane of the axon terminal, and that exocytosis dumps neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter then diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And again, what happens next depends upon what neurotransmitter it is that we're talking about here and what the receptor, the particular receptor, is for that neurotransmitter. And that's it. That's synaptic communication, both for the chemical synapse and for the electrical synapse that we started out with. Let's do a little bit of quizzing, and I'll get rid of some. I'll just make sure there's no labels here. And let me draw a chemical synapse while I'm here before we quiz about it, I guess. So for the first piece of it, I'm not even sure I gave you a real good definition, but if we say the word synapse, what does that mean? Go ahead and give your best answer to that. Pause the video, give your best answer, and then I'll come back with my answer to it. And my answer is a synapse is basically a connection between two cells, a communication connection through which one cell can communicate to the next cell. And most of the time we're talking about neurons communicating with the next cell, but sometimes it can be other types of cells. And if you're asked to define that, you might also put in there that there are two major types of synaptic connections, and those are the chemical synapse and the electrical synapse. Okay, next question. These are going to be kind of long questions, sorry. Well, I guess I could do some short one first. Let's do some of the anatomy of the chemical synapse. What does this represent? And the answer there is this is the axon, at least where I'm pointing my finger right there. That's the very end of the axon. What's this part? I guess this part is more properly the very end of the axon, sorry, but this is the axon terminal, also known as the axonal buton. Buton, by the way, is French for button. It's just a French pronunciation of the word button, because these things do kind of look like little buttons. When you look under electron microscopy at axon terminals, they look like little buttons. What are these little circles with dots in them supposed to represent? The answer to that is these are vesicles filled with neurotransmitter. Next, what do we call this space here between these two cells? The answer to that is this is the synaptic cleft or synaptic gap. Next, what about these big kind of dot things that I drew down here? What are those supposed to be? Those are supposed to be receptors for neurotransmitter. I guess we could go up here and say, what do we call this membrane, or what do we call this cell that's going to communicate to the next cell? This cell would be the presynaptic cell, or this membrane would be the presynaptic membrane. Let's continue that with the next one. What is this membrane, or what is this cell? This would be the postsynaptic cell, or this would be the postsynaptic membrane. Lastly, for a short question, for the electrical synapse over here, what are these? What are these membrane proteins called? And again, those are called gap junctions. Gap junctions give rise to the electrical synapse. Okay, now for the long form questions. I sometimes put these on my exams as essay questions. I'll go through the first or more common one. Describe communication at the chemical synapse. What are the steps to communication in the chemical synapse? And again, that one you should have paused, and it might have taken you 5 minutes to write it all out. But again, I'll go through it. An action potential comes down the axon and reaches the axon terminal. The charge change of that action potential causes voltage-gated calcium channels to open at the axon terminal, and calcium diffuses into the axon terminal. The calcium causes these vesicles filled with neurotransmitter to bind with and perform exocytosis at the presynaptic membrane, and to dump that neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. Then the neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft or synaptic gap and binds to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And again, the next thing to happen depends. Whatever this cell experiences, that's going to depend upon what particular neurotransmitter we're talking about and what particular neurotransmitter receptor for that neurotransmitter we're talking about. And that's the answer to that question of how does communication occur, or what are the steps of communication that happen in a chemical synapse. How about for the electrical synapse? How does that communication occur? Go ahead and do that one, and again, pause it and take a couple minutes maybe to describe in words how communication happens at synapse. And I'll give my answer now. At the electrical synapse, again, there are gap junctions, and those gap junctions act as channels for ions. So that if this cell up here undergoes an action potential, again, usually triggered by sodium entering the cell, that same sodium that brought about this action potential here because it diffused in, that sodium can now diffuse through those gap junctions and cause positive charge in this next cell, which will lead to this next cell undergoing an action potential. So the way communication happens at the electrical synapse is simply that ions can diffuse through these gap junctions and cause charge changes in that next cell. Lastly, an even possibly longer question would be to ask you to compare and contrast the electrical synapse with the chemical synapse. And there's a variety of different things that you could talk about, and I'll try and touch on all of them. But again, for yourself, do this before you listen to what I have to say. Compare and contrast the electrical synapse and the chemical synapse. What do they have in common, and how are they different? And I'll just go through some of the similarities and differences here. Obviously, these are both two forms of communication between cells. We've got communication via gap junctions and simply the diffusion of ions through those gap junctions at the electrical synapse. And over here, we have communication from usually a neuron to another cell by the release of neurotransmitter that then binds to receptors on that second cell. So the way the communication happens is different, but it's still a form of communication from one cell to the next. Other big differences for the electrical synapse. Whatever charge change this first cell underwent, this next cell is going to undergo the same type of charge change. In this case, positive charge came into this cell and caused an action potential. Positive charge is going to come into this next cell as well and cause an action potential. So basically with a chemical synapse, again, whatever charge change occurred in this first cell, it's going to happen to the second cell as well. Whereas with a chemical synapse, I didn't tell you the full story here about this, but remember I said what happens next depends? We could have an action potential initiated on this next cell. Or we could have this next cell go in the opposite direction and become hyperpolarized. It could become more negative on the inside instead of causing the cell to go through an action potential. And we could have other different things happen to this cell even, because the signaling of these receptors could involve the change in the chemistry of this cell. So the cell might undergo a change in metabolism somehow. So there's a bigger variety of possible effects when it comes to chemical synaptic communication. Whereas again with electrical synaptic communication, there's only one possibility, and that is whatever charge change happened here, the same kind of charge change is going to happen to this next cell. You could also say electrical synaptic connections are less complicated. There's only one protein involved, and that is the gap junctions, just a connection with gap junctions allowing for the communication to happen. Whereas over here, you have to have vesicles. Those vesicles have to have the neurotransmitter. You've got to have some kind of connection holding the axon terminal near the postsynaptic cell. And we haven't even talked about those proteins. You have to have receptors down here in the postsynaptic cell. And then depending on the receptor, you may have a more complicated complex of proteins in here for the signal to get transmitted through. So the chemical synaptic connection is always more complicated than the electrical synaptic connection. So those are just some of the things that you could talk about if you get that question of compare and contrast electrical synapse with chemical synapse. And I think we've covered it. We've covered what the chemical synapse is. We've covered what the electrical synapse is. We've described how the communication happens in both. And we've done a few questions that I hope help you get it together. My advice for you, make sure you know that story. Know all of the parts and know that story for how chemical synaptic communication happens. And it's a bit simpler, but do the same thing for the electrical synapse. Just make sure you know it. Once you know them both really well, comparing and contrasting them becomes very easy. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments down below. And thank you once again for watching.